But Liz, if you want to add me as co-host, that's fine.
There you are. Done. Yep. Have the fabulous Jane Kalmus coming in March to talk about story structure and plot. And if you haven't heard of her before, take a look at her YouTube channel. She's wonderful, and that's Kalmes. We've got Ellen Byron coming in June to talk about humor hacks from a sitcom vet. And so far, she is doing better than many, as well as can be expected. She lives in the LA area. And we've got one of our members talking about Agatha Christie in the fall. So we hope you join if you're not already a member. And whether or not you're a member, we hope you hop on to some of those virtual talks later this year.
Don't forget about CrimeCon.
And there's a fantastic conference in Connecticut, Michelle's home, and that's where I met Michelle, called CrimeCon. So that's CONN for Connecticut. That should be this spring.
May 17th. I just
May
met
17th.
with, I just met with Chris Knopf and Jill
Great.
Wednesday night. So
Excellent.
Mhm.
And that's a Saturday, and it's a budget-friendly conference, and it's well worth the day.
And it's easy to get to from New York, Massachusetts, the train ride. It's very close to the New York border too. And I apologize ahead of time if you hear dog paws running around upstairs, or my adult son is home and my husband's home. So it's a Saturday, typical Saturday at my house. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm glad this date worked. So it wasn't because I'm starting off it was just a date that just happened to work. So
because you're on call on Saturdays. So
I'm on call all the time. So yeah, it's exhausting. 3 years and 2 weeks. Not counting it off.
So you're still teaching as well.
Yes.
Wow. I am when I started looking into the topic you picked, just because it is so interesting, I noticed that there are more and more colleges with certificate programs in forensic genetic genealogy, even here in New Jersey.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's one of the newest tools, and it's proving to be working. So it's we'll get into that. So
Yeah,
it's great.
it's a
lot of work, but it's worth it. It's absolutely worth it.
We're going to start in a couple of minutes, but because you're early, you get the bonus of my nerdy background research. So if you're especially interested in writing on this topic, there are a couple of other mystery writers who do so. One is S.C. Perkins, and the book you might want to look up is Murder Once Removed. It's about a genealogist who discovers a photo and journal that prove a billionaire's great-great-grandfather was murdered in 1849. So, and then at least online on ABC, there's a show called The Genetic Detective that I haven't had a chance to watch. I don't know if you think it's worth the time, Michelle, if you've seen it.
I think that's with CC Moore.
Yes.
Yes. She basically, her and the company that she works for were the ones who basically helped solve the Golden State Killer.
Oh.
So even though this has been around for a very, very long time, believe it or not, that basically took forensic investigative genetic genealogy into the forefront of the media.
Yep, it sure did.
Mm-hmm. We'll actually talk about that case a little bit. This genealogy has been around for centuries.
Sure. Yes.
So it's nothing new.
I do like I write historical mysteries, and it is, I do have a lot of research to do, but at least I don't have to learn as much about forensics as some of my writer friends.
Mm-hmm.
So
I love historical mysteries. Those are my favorite.
and you're a member of the Guppies.
Yes. I am a guppy. Yes.
I'll ask what you're writing offline.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, in 3 years and 2 weeks, I plan to kick my manuscripts into overdrive. So it's just I like to sleep a little sometimes.
Well, I know we're still a minute early, but that reminds me of the way I wanted to start this presentation, along with saying thank you for being our first speaker of 2025.
Oh, I'm so honored you asked me, truly.
Yes. And I'm going to invite everyone who's listening to read your extensive biography online on the Maven's website under events. But please read it so you can see why Michelle finishes up that bio by saying in her spare time, she sleeps. Michelle Clark is a medical legal death investigator for the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Connecticut. She's a former crime scene technician for the Waterbury Police Department and is the case manager for all the unidentified deceased in the state of Connecticut. You work closely with local, state, and federal agencies on unidentified cold cases, and you were part of the serial killer task force that led to the discovery of 7 victims buried behind a strip mall in New Britain. You were the lead investigator in the 1944 Hartford Circus fire exhumation in hopes of identifying 2 women that perished in the fire who were never identified. And I'll skip a couple of paragraphs. And you are also an adjunct professor at the University of Hartford, where you teach forensic science and cold case investigations. You lecture for the Connecticut State Police Academy and the Henry C. Lee Institute on Death Investigations. You're a member of Mystery Writers of America and Sisters in Crime. And finally, the last line, in your spare time, you sleep. So,
Sometimes.
sometimes. And as Michelle said before we began, if you have questions, please feel free to include them in chat as we go along. And since Michelle is an expert juggler of work and other things, she'll take your questions as we go. So it's all yours.
Okay, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Mally. Mally, if you don't know, is phenomenal, and I work with her with CrimeCon conference, and she's just such a lovely, lovely person. And again, thank you so much for having me today. I'm glad this date worked out. It was the only date that worked out. I think we went through a whole year, and this was the only date I had available. So I'm glad it worked out. And I'm glad to be sharing this topic with you because it is new and exciting. Actually, it's really not new, and I'll go over a couple of cases like that. If you see the alphabet after my name, that just means I took wasted a lot of time taking a lot of examinations, and it didn't mean too much, but they love that when I do testify. Mally knows this, any one of you who have not ever seen any of my presentations, there are some disturbing pictures. I do work at the medical examiner's office, so I am a death investigator. I do have some pictures that may be disturbing, so just a heads up, I'm not going to warn you when that picture comes up, but I just don't want you to look like they do when they pop up on your screen, okay? All right, so genetic genealogy. Genealogy has been around for centuries, right? Starting from when, the Pilgrims came over here and in their Bibles, they were keeping track of their families' names and dates of birth. So it's not a new concept. It's just now we've added a new word to it, or two new words to it. First, it was genetic genealogy because we are taking your saliva or whatever you send into any of those companies in order to do your genealogy testing. That's considered genetic genealogy because we are taking your DNA, not me, but the companies are taking your DNA, they're extracting what are called SNPs. They're taking your full genome and they're uploading it into there, and they're seeing where you fit into different families. So obviously, we get our genes from our ancestors. Obviously, the closer the relative, the more DNA that you're going to share with those relatives. And there's 3 different types of DNA that we can use for investigative genetic genealogy. So there's the Y-linked or the Y gene, which obviously is passed through the male generation. You have the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed through maternal, okay, which majority of us on this Zoom meeting right now could probably share. Many of our mitochondrial DNA will probably be the same. And then there's nuclear DNA, and that is pretty much what we use not only in forensics, but also what we use in order to make our matches. So how much DNA do we actually share with the different generations? So if you look at self, you obviously share 50% of your DNA from your father, 50% from your mother. If you have any siblings, they also share 50% of DNA from the same parents. However, it's not the same exact DNA, or we all would be clones coming out of our parents, right? You are going to share 50% with your children. And as you go up a generation, so you share 25% with your grandfather, 25 with your grandmother, and you also have 4 sets of grandparents or 4 grandparents. As you get up to the great grandparent level, you share about 12.5% of DNA with them. As you get up to your great grandparents, you share 6.25%. As you get up to the great. So as you understand, where the further away you get, the less DNA you share. However, you still share a minute amount of DNA with those relatives. This is called the Shared Centimorgan Project. Centimorgans is basically how we match up when we do forensic investigative genetic genealogy. The centimorgans is basically the name of the amount of DNA that you share with someone, okay? So if, let's say, me and my brother, which I believe we share about 23,000 centimorgans with each other. So if you look at the self in the middle, I don't know if you can see my little arrow there. You have you, one of your siblings. You could share anywhere from 1,600 to 3,400 centimorgans with your sibling. You go over to your first cousin, and you can share anywhere from 396 centimorgans to 1,300 centimorgans, with the average being about 866. So if you actually Google shared centimorgan project or the DNA centimorgan project, this will come up, and they actually have a little thing you can type in how many centimorgans you share with certain people. When we do send cases out, whether it's a homicide case, whether it's an unidentified case, they'll, in the database that we look in, we'll get a number, and that number will tell us, okay, well, it's about 200 centimorgans, so it's probably around the second cousin once removed, or it could be anywhere between first cousin twice removed. And I'll give you some examples of that. But it's the shared centimorgan project, and centimorgans is basically the name of the amount of DNA that you share with someone. Do you know what family this is?
Romanovs?
Very good. The Romanov family. They actually, this was my first back way back when I was in grad school. I was very interested in DNA, and mitochondrial DNA had basically just started being used in not only the clinical field, but now in the forensic field. So I again love historical mysteries, things like that. So I was reading all about the Romanov family, and they obviously, everyone knows how they died, brutally murdered, when they thought that their Tsar's English cousin who was on the throne was going to save them. So they said, we need to take a picture of you to prove that you're still alive, and then you're going on a ship off to England, which obviously didn't happen. So all of them were shot to death, stabbed to death with bayonets, and buried in, I can't say this little town in Russia, but Ekaterinburg, Russia. And of course, through the years, there have been many people coming forward, and there were many rumors saying that not only did Anastasia survive, but also little Alexei, the little prince, survived as well. Hence the movie Anastasia from Disney, right? So the Queen, actually Queen Elizabeth II, asked if they could be exhumed and buried correctly, because they found out where they were all buried. So they did do a massive exhumation of all the bones. The problem with this was that when they put the bodies basically in this mass grave, and not only was the royal family killed together, but also their servants were also killed together. They put them in this mass grave, and they also dumped this hydrochloric type acid all over the bodies. And so the bones not only being buried for several hundred years, but also the acid, you can see it's a very wet environment, which is not conducive to DNA testing. So when they brought the bodies up and they were doing the testing, nuclear DNA was unable to be extracted. So they were able to extract mitochondrial DNA, but now they needed someone to compare it to. So Queen Victoria was related to, I have to move my little things over, I apologize. Queen Victoria, and if you go down Queen Victoria's line, Queen Victoria was the grandmother of the Tsarina Alexandra. And also she had another daughter, and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who was Queen Elizabeth's husband, was a descendant. So they took some DNA from Prince Philip. They also needed DNA from Tsar Nicholas's side of the family. So they went up a couple generations and came back down, and they found two people that were still alive at the time, the Duke of Fife and Zina and I forget what country she was from. So they were able to extract mitochondrial DNA and start to go through, and were able to identify not only the Tsar, the Tsarina, but also the oldest Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and little Alexei. So it took them quite a while to do this, almost a couple of years, but they were able to do that. And that in turn, not only let us know that, yes, they were all deceased, but also helped disprove all of these imposters that were coming forward and claiming that they were the young princess or the young prince of the Tsar's family. So what's the probability of finding a relative? Well, it's going to depend. I was going to say show hands, but some of you may have gotten some ancestry tests for Christmas, Mother's Day, Father's Day, some sort of holiday. And these are the different databases that there are out there. You got GEDmatch, Family Tree, MyHeritage, 23andMe, and Ancestry. So if you look in all the different databases, Family Tree, you got an 80% chance of finding a third cousin. MyHeritage, 95% of finding a third cousin. 23andMe, 99% of finding a third cousin. And there's 20 million profiles at the time that I took this picture, which was a couple months ago. And the numbers have been growing in all of these different databases, but you have 97% of finding a second cousin in Ancestry. Now, we cannot, as law enforcement or medical examiner's office, look into any of these private companies' databases. So unless someone, which is easy to do, uploads their DNA into GEDmatch, right, which only has 1.7 million profiles in it, that is the only database that law enforcement and myself are allowed to search through in order to make comparisons. Okay, so these private companies that you send your DNA off to, unless you opt in to have law enforcement be able to look at your family tree or even just your DNA, we are not allowed to go into any of those and do any comparisons. We are only allowed to go into GEDmatch, and now it's called GEDmatch Pro, which is for law enforcement use only. Hold on, I'm looking at your biologist. No, there's been evidence that paternal mitochondrial can sometimes mix in a small percentage. Sperm can carry, yeah, males have mitochondrial DNA as well. So you know, the mother passes her mitochondrial DNA to both her son and the daughter. If there's any forensic investigators to look for more than one source in the mitochondrial DNA analysis from one sample. The problem with mitochondrial DNA is that it's a little too arbitrary. So because like I said, I've gotten hits with mitochondrial DNA, but then when I went back and either did a comparison with dental or a comparison with nuclear DNA, it wasn't a match. So mitochondrial DNA, even though, yes, it has been a big help in certain family members that we know belong to that family tree, it is extremely helpful. But when it comes to actually trying to identify either a suspect or an unidentified person, it isn't specific enough. The statistics just aren't there as far as mitochondrial DNA. Laura, I hope I answered that question. Okay, so this is my office. I work at there's not, the cloud isn't always over my office, even though sometimes I feel like it is. The Grim Reaper does not answer the front door when you get there. And we investigate all suspicious unnatural deaths that occur in the state of Connecticut, including unidentified and skeletal remains. So basically, I go to every homicide, suicide, motor vehicle accident, overdose. We do investigate alcoholics because they can fall down, hit their heads, and end up getting subdural hematomas, which end up being traumatic. So any traumatic death technically falls under our jurisdiction. So all unidentified cases get a full examination. Now, obviously, I can't show this picture to who I think this person may be and say, hey, is this your loved one? Because I'd probably get fired. And even though people really want to see their loved ones, and I have to be a little blunt. And as I get older, I'm finding I have less and less patience with explaining things to people. So I will just say, listen, I'm so sorry, but your loved one was in their residence for several months. They decomposed to the point where they are no longer identifiable. So if you look at them, you will not be able to identify them. So now we have to identify them in different ways. Obviously, we get skeletal remains at our office. They're found in a wooded area. They could be found in residentials areas. I just had a couple. We have a lot of, believe it or not, homeless tent encampments, and animals will get to them and end up pretty much eating them to the point where they look like what you see here. So every unidentified person that comes in gets an X-ray, right? We want to make sure that there are no broken bones. Maybe there's an implant of some sort. So many people are bionic now. They get hip implants, they get knee implants. I know so many students of mine are actually getting a lot of implants already because they play sports, and they have teeny tiny little pins here, pins there, and those could be helpful when we do pre and post-mortem comparisons through x-rays. They get dental x-rays done. We could do comparisons. A lot of times with skeletal remains, the teeth will fall out, but if I'm able to find the teeth and put them back in, we can look at the different types of not only the fillings that you see here, any dental work that's been done, but also you could actually look at the vein lines and even the veins in the roots of the teeth that have not had any dental work done, and a forensic odontologist is able to make that comparison as well. I'm just looking at the chat here. Let's see, Pamela. I have had my DNA tested for heritage by ancestry. I'd be willing to allow my family tree to be examined by law enforcement. Well, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate that, Pamela. And again, like I said, you'd have to opt in. You would download your profile and then re-upload it into GEDmatch, and we'd be able to compare it that way. NamUs, not sure if any of you have ever heard of NamUs, but this is actually, if you Google NamUs, you can actually go in. This is the National Missing and Unidentified Person System. It's a three-way database. So all medical examiners' offices can put in their unidentified cases. All law enforcement can put in their missing persons cases. And then we have amateur sleuths that like to go through and say, hey, Michelle, I saw that you have this unidentified that was found in 1967. There is this missing person from 1966. Their description, height, weight, all of that seems to be the same as yours. Is it a possibility? And as an investigator, I am obliged to look into those cases. And if I think, yes, this could be a match, I call the law enforcement who's in charge of the case, and we talk about, is there any way we could physically or forensically make this match, whether it's dental, DNA, or anything forensically that we can do in order to do that. So as of January of, I can't see the date, 2024, there were 14,600 unidentified cases in the United States. So there's also, this was the most current I could find in NCIC, which is run by the FBI. It's the National Crime Information Center, which all law enforcement enter their violent crimes, missing persons into that database. And as of, I believe that says 2022, 93,000 missing persons. So if you take out those runaways, right? The kids that run away end up coming home later. If we take out the people who disappeared because they wanted to disappear, you're left with a couple thousand missing persons that could be unidentified somewhere, whether it's in Connecticut or any other state in the United States. So we do try to keep an eye on things like that. As far as forensic investigative genetic genealogy, and from here on, I'm just going to call it FIGG. There has been federal grants offered to different jurisdictions throughout the years. You have to apply for these grants. And because they see that these missing, unidentified, and violent crimes also need to be used, unfortunately, FIGG is not free. So we do have to find ways in order to pay for it. So again, when an unidentified comes into our office, we do every possible forensic way to identify them. We get as much information as we can at the crime scene. We have law enforcement running around trying to find any leads. I take a sample, send it to our state forensics lab. They extract nuclear, mitochondrial, and even Y DNA if it's a male. And they get it into what's called CODIS, which is the combined DNA index system. We'll talk about that in a sec. We do, if there's a head, I have cases where I don't have a head. So if there is a head, we could do teeth. If they're not completely skeletonized, we try to do fingerprints. And we also document any tattoos, jewelry, things like that, that are circumstantial as far as forensics goes, to see if we can identify them. It's not like the 80s where everyone had the barbed wire tattoo around their arm anymore. The tattoos nowadays are intricate. They mean something to people. So as we look at the tattoos, I will take pictures of those and I will get them up into the NamUs account for that unidentified person. So CODIS, again, is the combined DNA index system. The problem with CODIS, and a lot of people don't understand this, is why aren't you just solving cases through DNA? You know, can't you just take DNA at the scene and upload it into that CODIS database that everyone's been hearing about? Well, who's in CODIS? Convicted felons, sex offenders, and that is it. So unless you're a convicted felon, I can't match up anything to you. Unless you're a sex offender, I can't match up anything to you. Also, when we do collect samples from, let's say one of my children goes missing, and law enforcement comes to my house and they're like, we want to collect a sample from you and your husband, and any siblings that your missing child has, so that we can get it into CODIS. There is a missing person and unidentified side of CODIS that does talk to the criminal side. So there is another side. However, the unidentified person and missing person will talk to the criminal side, but the family members do not. So familial DNA does not talk to the rest of CODIS. So a lot of people, especially illegal aliens, anything like that, are very hesitant to give DNA samples, which I think is funny because they'll spit in a tube and mail it off to a company, but they're hesitant to give it to law enforcement because they're afraid maybe their uncle was, you know, or maybe they did something stupid when they were a teenager, or we find out they're a legal alien and we have to explain to them it doesn't go through the criminal side. We don't care. This is just only to identify your missing loved one if they become an unidentified person. If skeletal remains were found in 1968 were determined back then to be a 27-year-old male, how accurate would that age be? We'll talk about that because I have a couple cases. Is STR analysis and Y analysis always done on all samples? If STR seems to suggest that a sample is for a female based on, so Laura, STRs are done through our state laboratory. Y analysis isn't always done, and mitochondrial is not always done. We want nuclear done. For the males, especially when we do rape cases to try to find suspects, we do try to see if we can get that Y DNA, but it's not always done, no. Hope that helps.
It does. The reason I asked, I'm so sorry to interrupt very
Okay.
quickly. There are some, I'm so sorry, I'm the biologist here, and I had
That's
this
okay.
idea about a person. So there are genetic cases where you can have two X chromosomes and a very small piece of the Y chromosome jumps on the X. So I was curious if there could be a situation where you might have the wrong impression that you have a female DNA. And that can only be dispelled with a Y analysis. So it's interesting to see that you would start with STR, not necessarily do the Y analysis right away.
Yeah, we do. Well, part of the STRs includes the sex chromosomes.
Yes.
So
In that case,
yes.
it would trick you to think that there are two X's.
Well, very rarely do we run into the XXY issue. We also remember that we have a body. So we look at the pelvis. I have an anthropologist do an examination. So we look at the pelvis, we look at the skull. There's other ways for us to determine what the sex is. And unfortunately, forensically, there's no way we can determine if someone was transgender or going through transgender surgeries, anything to
no,
that
that's
effect.
not what I meant.
Yeah. No, I know. I'm just
solution
explaining this
is
to
different.
the general public, but yes. So far, we do have other ways of determining sex, not just through the STRs. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank
Okay,
you.
you're very welcome. So anyway, when we put things into CODIS, we've had cases in CODIS that have been sitting there for over 20 years because again, unless someone comes forward or it just spins and spins and spins. And I am not a patient person. I don't like waiting. So, Forensic Genetic Genealogy came around, or FIGG as we call it. And this turned our lives around as far as forensic investigators and as far as law enforcement goes. So this is the basic definition of what FIGG is. And as of 2021, the use of FIGG has led to over 150 suspects of murder and sexual assault cases. And that's not including all the unidentified cases that it has solved. So again, here we go with the Golden State Killer. These were the first two cases, the Golden State Killer and the Buckskin Girl. Buckskin Girl was an unidentified female that was found in a ditch. Again, everything was done forensically, spun around. And it wasn't until they did FIGG on her that they found out who she was. Now, the Golden State Killer had many different faces. Some of them look the same, some of them don't look the same, but he got away with 50 rapes, 120 burglaries all across California from it was hold on, I gotta move my stuff around, 1974 to 1986, and then all of a sudden it just stopped. 1986, he just stopped. So as investigators, why did he stop? Maybe he got too old, maybe he died, maybe he wasn't able to overtake his victims anymore. So there are a lot of different theories at the time of why he just suddenly stopped committing all these crimes. And so with a lot of the rape cases, they were able to hang on to the DNA, even back from way back then. And they ended up doing, and this was through the Cookman double homicide cold case, but this is basically how they found the Golden State Killer. So what they ended up doing was they sent in their DNA, or they sent in a sample from a rape of the Golden State Killer, and they came up with two cousins. And going through different types of, we use public records. So we use census records, birth records, death records. Obituaries are phenomenal. They have a slew of information in them. And they came to the conclusion that these two cousins that are cousins of the suspect don't match each other. So that means they're on two different sides of the tree. So that likely means that they're on the suspect's mother's side and the suspect's father's side of that tree. So we start building that tree backwards until we find what we call the most recent common ancestor. So once we start finding common ancestors and work the trees back down, we get to the parents, we get to the suspect, and the suspect, or the family, I should say, the surname, and we get to this family and we're like, okay, this matches up. He's the right age. He was the right age at the time of the killings. He was alive at the time of the killings. He is alive now. He's got 3 sisters, so we know it's not the sisters committing the crimes because we've got Y DNA in these rape cases. So this is just a tool. FIGG is just a tool. So it's just like if anyone called in and was a witness back 30 years ago and said, you know what, this has been on my mind and I wanted to come forward. It's just a tool that we use. So now investigators have to basically follow this suspect. So they're given a name, they're given an address. We can look things up. There's a database called Been Verified where we can find information on people. All of these are public databases that you can use. Facebook, Instagram, social media. People don't understand like the imprint that they leave all over the place to try to, and we use all of that in order to track people down. So police have to follow that suspect, right? So they followed him for about 10 days and they tried different ways of collecting DNA. They followed him to a parking lot and they swabbed his doorknob. And I'm like, not the doorknob, but the handle of the car. Other people could drive his car. So that's not a good way to get specific DNA. So then they ended up getting a sample from a trash pull, right? They tried to figure out how many people are living in his house. They knew he was living by himself. Then they take that DNA, they send it to their state lab and they put it through CODIS and bam, you get a hit, right? So that is the legal way that we have to do these cases because you can't use FIGG as a definitive way in order to identify a suspect or an unidentified person. You have to find families in order to find, and then once you find families, you have to get a sample from that person in order to make that, I'm just sorry, I'm reading the things. All right, there's a couple here. I'm just gonna keep going if you guys don't mind, because I really wanna make sure we finish on time. And then I'll go back to any questions that you have. Most recent Idaho murder. So Brian Koberger murdered 4 college students in their apartment. Very brutal murder. He left the knife sheath at the residence, and they were able to get DNA from that knife sheath. Now, of course, they took that DNA, they put it into CODIS. They obviously did not get a hit. And then if you ever get your hands, and it's actually public record now, if you ever get your hands on the search warrant for Brian Koberger, it's phenomenal. So they basically pinged his car. Because nowadays we have Big Brother everywhere, right? So they saw his car surveillancing the area a couple of times. They followed his car back to Washington State University, where he was going to school as a criminal justice major. Obviously, he's not a very good criminal justice major because he couldn't couldn't commit a crime without getting caught. And they ended up following his car, pinging his phone once they found out what his phone number was, and pinging it all the way back to Pennsylvania. At the same time, they put his DNA into GEDmatch Pro. It did hit to his father. They confirmed who his father was, and they followed him to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania police did a trash pull, and they ended up getting Brian's DNA, putting it into CODIS, and got a hit. But if you get your hands on the search warrant, they did a phenomenal. That is a perfect investigation, in my opinion, based on today's technology that we can use in order to find these people who commit these crimes. So again, FIGG is just another amazing tool. However, you got to pay for it, right? A lot of cities, smaller law enforcement, and even my state agency, we're in the red all the time. We can't afford it. So there are many companies that will do crowdfunding, which is the company I use, does all crowdfunding for me. There are a lot of nonprofit organizations like the DNA Doe Project that will help with paying for GenMatch. Also, NamUs, which is part of the NIJ and Department of Justice. They will pay for certain cases if you request that too. So many different departments, again, can't pay for it, but they can pay for the initial extraction, the sequencing, the upload into GenMatch Pro, but then they run out of money because you have to pay the genealogist. And I can tell you the 1974 case, which we'll get into, that I worked on took me over a year to work on. So imagine paying me per hour to work on these cases for over a year. I would have loved to have gotten paid for them, but that's just not how I am. So there are a lot of company or a lot of law enforcement agencies that came to me and they're like, listen, we got up to this. And I said, well, how far did they get? And they said they only went up 2 generations. And I'm like, and how much money did you pay? You know, and they're paying $10,000, $20,000. And it can, like I said, take up to years to try to solve these cases. Another problem is if the bodies are in which the unidentified bodies that we want to, exhumations cost money too. How I'm getting around that now is I'm having law enforcement agencies do search warrants for them so that the cemeteries don't have to charge us for their workers to dig up the body. The problem is if there's a vault, because caskets go into vaults, which go into the ground. Right? If the vault is compromised, if that casket is compromised, those all need to be replaced. It's really great to be friends of different types of funeral homes throughout the state, because I'm like, listen, we're doing this exhumation of a body from a 1986 homicide. She's unidentified. Do you mind donating a casket or maybe donating some money for the vault replacement? And majority of the time they're like, whatever you need will help. There's also water damage that could compromise the remains, and that's what ended up happening with the Hartford Circus fire cases. There was so much microbial DNA that was contaminating the bones and the teeth, that even the teeth that we had roots growing through the teeth, which is not what you want to see when you pull the mandible out of the ground. But there just wasn't a way for us to, or the companies to extract the the microbial DNA from human DNA. Violent crimes, a lot of agencies, law enforcement agencies are willing to spend money on these violent crimes, which 100% I agree with. But a lot of these cold cases, many are unidentified remains and prior to CODIS actually existing. So, I have cases from 1960s and higher. So what about undetermined deaths? So sometimes we get unidentified remains, skeletal remains. There's no bullet holes. There's no stab wounds in the bones. We have no idea how they died. So even though we deem them as undetermined, they technically could be homicide cases. And we just don't know that because we don't know who they are and we can't work our way backwards in order to find out who they are so we can find out what happened to them. So here are some of the cases that I worked on and was able to solve through FIGG. I had the skeletal remains from 1983. Autopsy showed that he was a white male, obviously skeletonized. We did find a tan jacket with him. He was pulled from the Connecticut River, no other clothing and no ID. In 2011, because I wasn't working in 1983, I put him into NamUs. We did dental charting. 2012, I sent a sample up to our forensics lab. We did get nuclear and mitochondrial DNA on him, and all of that was entered into CODIS. 2022 was when I started working with a FIGG company. We got no hits, no new leads. I spoke to the Connecticut State Police because it was their case, and they agreed to send the sample up to the FIGG company that I'm working with. Right off the bat, bam, 33,531 centimorgans. That is a parent-child relationship. So whoever his child had put their sample into one of the ancestry databases, entered it into GEDmatch, and allowed law enforcement to be used, and we got a match. And that is my unidentified person there on the left. So again, parent-child relationship. So I call his son. These are not phone calls I like to make. Call his son, and I say, listen, I don't know how to say this. I'm just going to be blunt with you. We found your father back in 1986. He was a floater. We were just able to identify him through, FIGG testing. And of course, he starts crying and he said, listen, there were witnesses that saw my father jump off the Memorial Bridge up in Springfield, Massachusetts. And he always wore this tan jacket. Ding, clue, tan jacket. All these years, we never knew if he survived that jump and just left us for another family. My siblings and I just had a difficult time with it. So I drove up to Massachusetts. I got a sample from him. We did another comparison through CODIS and we got a hit. Parent-child hit. So his death certificate was signed out. I worked at the funeral home. He was cremated. I brought his cremains back up to his son, and he was obviously forever grateful. Skeletal remains from 1979. Now, mind you, this is 1979, and they did a pretty good job with some of the pictures. Although nowadays we use placards to put down for evidence. We don't take a picture of us pointing to evidence. So again, remember the 1979, they probably didn't have placards back then. So he's pointing to the skull. The guy in the background, I have no idea what he's pointing to up in the air. There was nothing up there. We got a skull, we got a sacrum, we got a long bone there below the sacrum. We also don't put our shadows in any pictures. These are things of what not to do. I show my students. Some clothing and one of those little clocks that was like a little travel alarm clock was also found. Not even sure if they were hers or not. This is what NamUs looks like. So she was entered into NamUs in September of 2011. This was the DNA that I sent up to the lab. We also did dental charting. That's what you see here. She was entered into CODIS in 2012. We did get mitochondrial and nuclear DNA, and it's spun around since 2012. Oops. And 2011, anthropology did confirm it was a female, white female between the ages of 18 and 30. Cause of manner of death, undetermined. Had no idea why she died. So worked with the company, sent it up to FIGG. Also, because she was around the age of 18 or less than 21, the NCMEC, so the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's, phenomenal agency. They will work with law enforcement. They work with my agency on any unidentified cases of children or young adults. I worked with them on several different cases and they're phenomenal. They'll do these sketches. So what I did with a CT scan of the skull, sent the copy of that CT scan out to them, and they make these reenactment models or sketches of the person. But the nice thing about them is that they update them as their technology gets better. They update those pictures as well. So they're a phenomenal agency to work with as well. For that case, we did get 2 good leads. In 2013, I got a call from a detective in Vermont. She said, listen, your unidentified and my missing person from Vermont mitochondrial matches. And again, because mitochondrial is so arbitrary and there's no good statistics on it as far as comparisons can go, I was able to get dental from this missing girl in Vermont, compared it to our dental, and it was not a match. 2017, I get a call from a detective. Again, both cases were in CODIS. They would have hit from 2017, and they never did. So discussion with lead detective, send that sample out in 2022, and we didn't get a hit, but we got a lead, right? So it was only 105 centimorgans. So that's probability relationship of second cousin once removed or first cousin 3 times removed. So we worked that tree for a very long time. Again, we got our first match was 230, second match was 105, third match was 41 centimorgans. Found out that the first match and third match actually matched each other. So we knew these two were cousins. This match was a cousin, but didn't match these two. So we knew that was on the other side of the tree. Work both trees back up, start working them back down. And when I say work up, we get into like the 1700s. This looks easy because this is our final picture of what it looks like. You got to remember, people in the 1800s, especially in the United States, it was all farmlands. They had anywhere from 13 to 20 something kids. And not only did they have 13 to 20 something kids, they ran out of names for those 13 and 20 something kids. So everyone was named Edward, John, Michael, John, Edward. It's like, oh my God, they're all named the same. And not only did people die off, but then they married their sister or they married their brother. So now you have, not technically wrong, but you now have intermarriage of brothers and sisters of wives and husbands that are going through here. So end up finding a most recent common ancestor, work my way down. She was born in 1941. Can't find anything on social media recently, since there was no social media back in the 70s. Can't find anything recent on her. She had 2 siblings. A brother lived in Florida, sister lived in Vermont. I called the brother, had the very difficult conversation. He said, I haven't heard anyone say her name in over 30 years. And I'm like, I'm really sorry. And he's like, no, this is fantastic. Thank you. He goes, hold on, I'll get my sister on the phone. She's closer to you. Traveled with a detective up to Vermont. We get a sample from the sister, send it to our state lab, and we get a match. And unfortunately, she's still unidentified. Her death certificate is undetermined. We believe there was a suicidal nature to this, but we can't prove it because it's skeletal remains, and we can't do any toxicology on skeletal remains. So her ashes, I brought her ashes back up to her sister, and she's buried with her mom. When we do have to exhume samples, again, they're not in very good conditions and they get icky uggy. We need to identify them to figure out what happened to these unidentified. So here's my case that was very, very close to my heart. 1974, unidentified female. And this was very strange because this is not a normal case. We know exactly how she died. She was shot, a gunshot wound to the head. I know exactly when she died, December 31st of 1970. I know who killed her. 2 suspects actually admitted and were incarcerated for her and her boyfriend's death at the time in 1974. I know where she was killed. She was killed in a house up in Ledyard in Connecticut here. And I know why she was killed. She called her family, said she was scared, didn't want to do this anymore. She told another female, that female told her boyfriend and another friend, and they ambushed this unidentified female and her boyfriend because they were afraid she was going to rat them out because they were robbing banks throughout the eastern coast. So normally we don't have all this information when we have an unidentified person. We have to identify them first in order to get all this information. So this case was very close to my heart because we didn't know who she was because she used an alias. So that's why. And the only other person who probably knew her real name was killed at the same time she was killed. So she used an alias. So 2 bodies in a shallow grave, hers and her boyfriend, who was not a very nice guy. He was later identified as uh, Gustavus Carmichael, and he was wanted by the FBI. So we have this unidentified female. I had all her bones. There's the gunshot wound to her head to the right there. The other female did make sketches back in 1974 of what she did look like. I did dental on her. She did have some dental restorations done. And this is some of the belongings that she had with her. She had this ring from 1917. Obviously, it wasn't hers. I thought maybe a grandmother, a family member. We went through every high school, every nursing school, everything we could throughout the Eastern Coast, could not find anyone. We talked to all the different ring companies who could have made that ring and got no hits. This was some of her clothing that she had. And her case went into NamUs, like I said, back in, looks like 2011, I believe I put that in. 2014, we put her into CODIS. We got mitochondrial and nuclear. And the reason it was so long into CODIS was they couldn't get good samples from what we had. And we waited and we waited. And again, I don't like waiting. FIGG comes along. Enter it into GEDmatch Pro, which is the only database I can use in order to make comparisons. We found out she definitely is a white European, and my top match was only 182.6 centimorgans. So this is what GEDmatch Pro looks like, or GEDmatch looks like. So you get these kit numbers, you'll get a name, whether it's a real name or people use aliases, you'll get an email, and then you find out how long that sample has been in there. Here's my total centimorgans in the middle here. And then I start working my way down. 182. Again, if you went into the shared centimorgan project, punch in the number. That's telling me it's second cousin once removed, first cousin thrice removed, which is pretty. So I'm looking at grandparent or great grandparent level. I work my tree, which took me over a year to do. I look at death records. I looked at obituaries, birth records, census records, and ended up coming down to finding this woman named Linda Oliver. She was born in 1946. I found a couple of obituaries that had mentioned her. I found a divorce complaint, Linda Childers, and I looked up her husband, and it says last marriage ended by death. Okay, how did he know that? So keep going, keep looking. This was her mother's obituary, and it says that her mother was preceded in death by her daughter, Linda. So I worked the tree all the way up. I had my top match, my 9th top match, work the tree up, work it back down. I call the sister, and ends up she's sending me pictures. I'm in constant contact with her. She did have a daughter, and I was able to get the daughter's DNA, and she ended up being solved. I'm still in contact now. I solved this a year ago, and I'm still in contact with that family because they are just so grateful. I'm just so grateful because that case was very, very close to my heart. So again, we do not stop. We educate ourselves. We reach out to other departments to see what we can help. And I went back to school at 2 years ago. So I went back to school. I graduated. I'm not going to tell you when, but you can learn new tricks. Okay. I was very, very scared to go back to school and learn a new, something new, especially nowadays with how everything's online being taught. So I was very nervous, but I did it, and anyone can go back to school. So my whole theory is unless they're all unidentified, cold cases, and all the cold cases are solved and these victims are brought home to their families, we do not stop. So thank you. And I have a couple of questions, I'm sure. Mally, do you want me to get to the chat ones first, or you're muted? I can't hear you.
Of course I am. Let's let's go through chat first.
Okay, let's
And
see.
and so I think you've gotten most of them. Can you tell at a glance the general age of a skeleton, i.e. fairly recent versus 19th century Native American, or does material, type of soil the skeleton is preserved in a big variable here?
I can't. My anthropologist is phenomenal at doing that. So she is able to determine, because any skeletal remains that seem historical in nature, so whether they're American Indian, different types of tribes, anything that looks historical in nature, we're able to give back to the archaeologists and the historical society, and they will get those remains back to the proper tribes that we have here in Connecticut. I also have an archaeologist. We did find a very interesting case in Newtown, believe it or not, where a person was digging up their basement, and their basement was all dirt. So they were redoing the basement. And we ended up finding soldiers from the Civil War. So the buttons, so they were not only Confederate, but they were from both sides of the Civil War. And we were able to, I know our archaeologist was able to try to figure out at what point. I didn't even know there was a battle here in Connecticut, but apparently there was. And they had one mass grave for everybody.
Wow.
So that was a really cool case. Of course, it wasn't forensically significant for me. I just went, looked, said, you guys don't need me, and left. But we have had very neat historical cases. But again, that's what we have anthropologists and archaeologists for.
Wow. I see another question here. Can a DNA match be made from a blood sample found at a crime scene when the likely suspect's only criminal conviction was drunk driving?
Not drunk driving, unless they did some time. Usually drunk driving, you're not quite convicted, but anyone who ends up in jail after, usually it's 3 strikes and then you're incarcerated. So we do get blood sample DNA samples from you have to be convicted of a crime in
Mhm.
order to be in CODIS.
Okay. Lots of props for such a great presentation. And then another question from Kate to revisit her question. How accurate was age determination in the 1960s? This is regarding bones found in 68, said to be a 27-year-old male.
They do the best they can. Age determination is difficult, especially if we're missing certain bones. So again, our anthropologist, we always give age ranges. So she could probably narrow it down to a 5-year range, but I extend it out to a 10-year range in order to make sure that I'm covering as many possible matches as I can. So, and when we have a 10 age range, especially for that 1974 case, I did a 10 age range. So I knew she was probably born in the 40s, if she was in around her early 20s, in the 70s. So it's one of those, I forget when she was born, but so we do we build it out to about 10 years to make sure that we can get as many people. We don't want to cut anybody out. And again, sometimes even ancestry, we call race ancestry now. So there is difficult because America is a melting pot. Sometimes people of Latino or Hispanic ancestry will look, as far as our anthropologist is concerned, will either look African American. So sometimes, again, ancestry is difficult and may not be accurate, as well as age, but we do the best we can as far as that goes, which is why FIGG is so helpful to us, because it will tell us exactly where that person's from, at least where their ancestors are from, and then we can start narrowing it down. That way it's like, okay, well, we thought this person was, maybe African American, turns out they're not, they're Latino. So that part of the ancestry does help us out a lot.
Wow.
Mm.
Well, we've reached the end of the program, so I'm going to ask the last question,
Of
which
course.
if anyone on Zoom is interested in learning more about FIGG, is there a book or a site you would recommend for more information?
There are, if you go, like I said, to that shared Centimorgan page, they do have webinars on there. Some are free. If you sign up, you don't have to be certified in FIGG in order to do any of that. Even genealogy pages, if you look up a couple of different genealogy pages, but the shared Centimorgan project or the DNA Painter website is phenomenal. They do free webinars, and if they have all their old ones recorded, so you can always go back and look up other ones in there. So there's a million books out there. There's so much information out there now that you can definitely look up on. And again, if you have any questions on it, I don't mind. I'll put my email in the chat right now. If you have questions that you want for your book, if you have genealogy in there somewhere that you're writing, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have as far as that goes. But you got to send me a copy of your book because I want to read it. So
That is so generous of you.
of course.
Your email, as you said, is in the chat right now for anyone. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone else for spending an hour of your valuable weekend with all of us. For future presentations or programs, go to the Maven's website, Sisters in Crime, Upper Hudson chapter, and we hope we see you all again. Thank you, Michelle. You're just awesome.
I love you, Molly. You're
love
phenomenal.
you back.
And thank you so much for having me. This I hope everyone learned a little something and had a fun hour.
Definitely.
All right.
Take care, everyone, and happy writing.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks for having me.